Mindset is huge. Our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to our content, our relationship to our audiences are all a huge part of what makes somebody a good communicator or a great communicator, what makes you feel really good about what you're doing on a professional level. What I'm finding over the last 15 years or so is that many of the people who come to see me, not all, but many of the people who come to see me are grappling with something from their past or even something from their present, but typically past, that influences those things I was just talking about today. So in other words, it influences how they see themselves in their work environments. A very common phrase is imposter syndrome. It's more people than I would have ever imagined have imposter syndrome. And I've come to see this because they bring it into my office.
This is Flavors of Emotions, expanding your emotional palette for a tastier life. My name is Kim Korte. Together, we explore how to make sense of our feelings through the lens of a chef, understanding flavors and a recipe. I am here to help you refine your emotional palette to differentiate the emotions that shape your world. I am super happy to welcome Lisa Wentz as my guest today. I could talk on and on about Lisa, but instead I'm just going to let her explain who she is and what she does in the world of coaching around communication and public speaking.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you, Kim. So my background and what I do is kind of vast. I have an undergraduate degree in psychology, probably informs my coaching a little bit. But from there, I was a stage actress, a very well-trained stage actress for about 10 years, and then got my first pedagogical degree in Alexander technique training and started teaching in drama conservatory. So I was working with actors and teaching them voice and speech skills, acting, and Alexander technique. My master's degree comes from the Central School of Speech and Drama, University of London, which is the epicenter for voice and speech work, let's say in the Western world. And from there, while I was in graduate school, I decided to switch my focus from training actors and traditional performers, as we think of them, to working with people in different industries, business professionals, medical, finance, whatever, across different industries. And so in any case, I opened up the San Francisco Voice Center in 2009, which eventually became my private practice, which you can find me, lisawentz.com. That's my private practice. And in terms of what I do, I mostly see private clients, and I usually do short, dense programs with them. And they could be anywhere from just starting in the professional world and really needing to get their communication skills polished and ready, upwards people who have been considered great communicators for dozens of years.
There's definitely a technical aspect to this, right? Like the preparation, the appearance. But there has to be a side to this that's emotion-based, because emotions play into everything. How do emotions play into the work that you do?
Thanks for asking. So yes, I agree. Mindset is huge. Our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to our content, our relationship to our audiences are all a huge part of what makes somebody a good communicator or a great communicator, what makes you feel really good about what you're doing on a professional level. In terms of specifics in the way I work, what I'm finding over the last 15 years or so is that many of the people who come to see me, not all, but many of the people who come to see me are grappling with something from their past or even something from their present, but typically past, that influences those things I was just talking about today. So in other words, it influences how they see themselves in their work environments. A very common phrase is imposter syndrome. It's more people than I would have ever imagined have imposter syndrome. And I've come to see this because they bring it into my office. Or they have an inner critic. And sometimes that inner critic shows up because they're in a vulnerable position, suddenly being in front of the cameras or in front of large audiences. It surfaces, whereas they were able to compartmentalize it before they got to a certain point in their career. So when we have the thoughts, as we all know, thoughts trigger our emotions that trigger our physiological responses to the whole package. And all these things work in tandem, and they can work in tandem for us in great, healthy ways that make us feel great and wonderful. and they can work against us a bit. So how does emotion play a part? In the negative sense, it plays a part that way, that no matter what it is that you're going through in these moments where you're not feeling as secure, you're not feeling as confident as you would like to be feeling, some inner critic or imposter syndrome is nagging at you, it shows up. And even for speakers who are, let's say, as I said a minute ago, have been doing it for dozens of years, they've learned to compartmentalize things, but it's not a good experience for them. So an audience may not notice it. An audience may not notice that they're not feeling great that particular day or in this particular moment in time, but they feel it. So their experience going up to the podium or in front of the hands-on meetings or in front of investors or wherever they are, conference circuit, is a negative experience, even when they're getting positive feedback back to themselves. Does that make sense, Kim?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I always say that it's an emotion that we have inside of us that triggers the thoughts that are associated to that emotion that we experience, that then triggers and reinforces that emotion as those thoughts keep coming on, and we feed that thought instead of rather overcoming it. If we have imposter syndrome, it's usually underlying like some insecurities. And you said, what was the other phrase that you used? So it's kind of your job to give them a sense of confidence, would you say? What emotion are you trying to help them develop so that they can be a better speaker? Because I'll be honest, I mean, there are times when, yeah, you don't notice that the speaker's having confidence issues or other types of issues. And then there's times that you do. And so being a confident speaker or whatever emotion you deem to work on is, I believe, important for many reasons.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So let's take the two apart. So one is when it is noticeable by your audiences and when it's not. So I want to address those separately. But before I do, I also want to address the way that you phrased it. What emotion am I helping them with, right? I feel like, and maybe this is because I sometimes work in a very direct way and sometimes I work in a nonlinear way. I think I'm a more nonlinear person, frankly. So I may be going at things sideways and backwards for people, even when I'm asking a direct question. So I see it as I'm helping them connect the dots from what they have compartmentalized or put away that they don't want to deal with. So in some ways, I feel like it's more logic driven or intellectually driven than it is emotionally driven. The emotions that come to surface are a benefit and a payoff from investigating. So the way I see my job is to help them identify the problem in the first place. Sometimes, because I've worked with many different people, we all have, right? Sometimes people will walk into my office, and they know exactly what the problem is, and sometimes they won't. And so if they know exactly what the problem is, then it's my job to empower them to confront it and to get it out of the way so that they can be a more empowered speaker, communicator, and live a more empowered life. That sounds kind of hokey as I'm saying it, but that is the result of the work. The people that I feel that I'm helping the most in this category are the people who haven't even connected the dots yet, that have a trauma in their past that's still affecting them today that they don't even look at, because that's kind of what trauma is, right? Or at least the effect of trauma feels like it's something bigger than we can hold or deal with. And so to survive in life, we put it to the side. We compartmentalize it. A part of our personality will take it. So our main personality that has to function in the world doesn't have to deal with it, we think. But of course, in the subconscious, we're dealing with it. Whether it's anxiety before we have to speak, meaning several days before a conference, somebody may be panicking for up to 7-8 days sometimes. Sometimes it's the night before, or they notice that they do self-sabotaging behaviors like avoid the prep at all until the last minute because they're so used to compartmentalizing, they just want to be put on the spot or something like this. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question in terms of what my job is, but I think the first step is identifying what it is that's holding them back or getting in the way of them feeling fully present and feeling that they're communicating how they want to, when they want to, and feeling good about it. If there's something in the way, we have to look at it, acknowledge it, and then move it out. So if somebody's listening to this right now and they're thinking, well, I've always had an inner critic, I'll always have it. No, you were not born with an inner critic. You were not born with imposter syndrome, just like you were saying, Kim. No one is born with this. No babies have imposter syndrome. This is what comes out of living in this world. If sometimes we have negative influences and so on. So in terms of my job, that's what I do. And then from there, we do all the other creative work. Sometimes I rewrite people's talks for them or their speeches. Sometimes I don't need to, or we might do it together. I work on the creative side, which is sort of directorial side of public speaking or communication. I get to tell them where I think they should move, where I think they should look, which words they need the audience to hear and how to emphasize them. So we get to craft the delivery during the process of working together, as well as the intellectual and emotional side.
So emotions are intertwined in this. I know people like to say, oh, there's emotion and there's logic, but actually there's a lot of logic in emotion when you look at it for what it is. And that is communication. And the one thing that I've always said is that feelings aren't facts and that there can be a miscommunication. And in our ability to be effective communicators, it helps when we are more connected to that inner communication with us. And so it sounds to me like what you're doing is helping them with their anxiety. You brought up that word. And then you also are probably giving them a lot more confidence, which underlying that is trust. You would be doing that with multiple things, with the things that you just mentioned, how they move on the stage, the words that they use, how they craft their speech, but also by getting rid of, or at least quelching that inner critic, because it's usually, if it's been around for a long time, is pretty strong. And so I would think that that is what really helps to make that speaker great or get greater at what they're doing. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's good to remember, the process of the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, all being interconnected, whether
Yes.
it kind of doesn't matter how we get in. This is reminding me of a client story. Yeah, I want to share because I think it's helpful for people. So when my training as an Alexander Technique teacher tells me that the thought stimulates an automatic physiological response and or an automatic emotion. So the thought, as soon as I get the call, not me personally, but let's say a speaker gets the call from their boss saying, hey, listen, I want you to present such and such tomorrow. Okay. The thought of that is what triggers the emotional response of panic, if they have panic, right? And then they notice it showing up in their body. Usually they notice it showing up in their body. Sometimes my job is also to help them notice how they're responding on a physical level, right? But in any case, there's other times, this is the client story I have, there's other times where the information comes in a different way. So I had this one speaker who had trouble with larger stage environments or larger audience environments, specifically if her CEO was there. And there wasn't anything noticeably off about her CEO. He seemed very supportive. He was a great speaker, but there was something about him that was triggering her. Later, he was fired. It turned out he was a sexual predator. And so what's interesting about this is that she didn't know that. She didn't have that information on an intellectual level. She was picking up on it in almost psychic way. On an energy level, he was triggering her and she was shutting down. But because there was no proof of why that should be happening, she ended up blaming herself and thinking, well, I'm just neurotic. I guess I'm just a bad speaker. I guess this, I guess that. The reality is that she didn't feel safe near him because he wasn't really a safe person. You know what I mean? So it's good to remember that in the end of the day, which part of this puzzle comes first? Is it the instinctual information that's coming in by instinct? Is it emotional? Is it intellectual? However it comes in, whatever's happening, we have to be able to say, maybe it's happening for a reason, a good reason. We're being told something by our subconscious mind or by actual literal direct information or indirect instinctual information. And that information needs to just be looked at and maybe not necessarily dealt with right away if you don't know what it is that's bothering you. Because I wouldn't have known that either. I didn't, well, how would I have known it as her coach,
Right.
But regardless, I'm not sure if that was an interesting story for you or not, but it's good for the listeners, I think, to remember if something is off, it's off. And it may be because of your own inner workings, and you may be triggered because you are feeling vulnerable, and vulnerability in the past hasn't been safe for you. But either way, it's okay. You are going to be able to handle it, and it is something you can move through very quickly. At least that's my experience as a coach.
No, I agree. And there's an interesting work by this one neuroscientist where he talks about the mind. The brain gets, 11 million bits of information every second. And we can actually handle consciously about 64. I don't even know if it's 64 bits of information. And how it can be getting this information that she's getting from her experience with him, but that she's not able to pick up, but her body can. Her brain is doing it. And because her brain can do that, it's sending those signals. I always thought that was a very interesting understanding of why sometimes we get these feelings and we don't understand what's going on and why we should trust it. Because our brain, yes, we might be throwing our history into why that is going on. But also there's some things that you're picking up that you might not be consciously aware of. So investigating those feelings and trusting them a little bit more is really important.
Right.
So I think it's a great story.
Yeah. And I think it boils down to, yes, trust in everything you just said, but also instilling a sense of control, remembering that you have control. Because a lot of times when we have anxiety, when it comes to public speaking, or we have anxiety when I say public speaking, I don't necessarily mean just on main stage environments, right? It could just be a meeting for that matter that you've got to do a presentation on, or a pitch or an update. But that feeling of lack of control is only going to make those feelings worse. So decide that you're going to assert some control over the situation. Even if the assertion is, okay, I'm feeling triggered right now. I'm not 100% sure why. I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to breathe a little deeper. I'm going to make sure I don't go into my head and into an internal space where I'm going to spin about it. I'm going to stay present with everybody in the room, and I'm going to take in information with my eyes, and I'm going to choose that I do have control over my physiological responses right now, and I am in a safe place. Instead of feeling trapped, unsafe, and allowing anxiety to take over.
Yeah. Breathing has an automatic calming effect because it slows the heart rate down. Our respiratory system actually can control our heart rate and bring it down and calm our whole body just with breath. And it only takes a few, right?
Yes, I'm there. The funny thing is that most of my breath training is Shakespeare related, because as an actor, it's all voice and speech for stage related, which of course then translates into voice use and speech for speaking, obviously, because that's what it is. But it's funny how I don't actually have a lot of information and or experience with breath work, because for me, it's mostly about just making sure, as you were saying, that you combat the adrenaline rush by getting more oxygen into the brain, into the body, and that you're slowing down your tempo rhythm and creating pauses. And that's what the kind of work on breath I do. But one of these days, it's on the list. One of these days, I'm going to go and do some fancy breath work that what other people do.
Well, who knew that there was Shakespeare breathing? I like to go back to a point you were talking about. It's not really just people who are looking to be on stage and speaking to large crowds. It's the smaller presentations that you have to do at an organization or just to a team. And it can be entirely nerve-wracking for people. And not everybody will get the great opportunity to work with you. Can you talk a little bit about your book, the title, and how it was designed? Because I know you were trying to fill a certain place in the book marketplace on speaking that you felt was missing.
Right. Thank you. Yes, I wrote a book called Grace Under Pressure, a masterclass in public speaking. And yes, I was trying to fill a certain need and contribute in a way that I hadn't seen any other books really contribute to the work. how it's different. Most public speaking books like Talk Like TED and a few others out there, I'm not saying they're not good. They are good. But mine works more like a handbook. It's sectioned into 3 sections. The first section is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, the areas where we might feel held back by different parts of our lives, training, whatever it might be. And so those are real client stories of mine. I've changed their identities. People will not be recognized in any way, but each one speaks to a different issue that I seem to come across a lot. So whether it's false beliefs, imposter syndrome, inner critic, whatever it is, it's in there in the first one, in the first section of the book, and has some exercises for each thing of what I did with my clients and what I suggest people can do. There's 34 exercises all in from the beginning of the book to the end. The middle section is about the physical training of voice and speech. So that's your posture coordination, breathing for speech, resonant sound of your voice, how we increase our resonance, physical articulation of language. And then the third part is about delivery technique. And so that goes more into the books like Gravitas or Talk Like TED or similar, because I'm basically giving exercises and advice to make the particular talk you're giving at that time and place a better one for you, a better experience. It's more polishing delivery in that section. And of course, there's interpersonal skills mixed in to the book, which would be the smaller meetings, the one-on-one meetings, going to the wedding and having to give a toast you're nervous about, these kind of things are interwoven in it. Yeah.
I love that because it's not like you're just gearing it towards the super executive, because I know that you've worked with a lot of executives, but this helps, like you said, the best man who's got to give a speech at a wedding and the person who is a small business owner and has to talk to his employees on a regular basis. It spans the gamut, which is important. And the fact that you've got, things that they can take action on and exercises for them to perform, I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask, well, let you go first. You had a thought, and I was going to go in a different direction.
The thought I was going to share is, right, because it does need to be tangible. We're talking about the physical act of speaking and showing up. So there's got to be some extra, this is why I wrote it. There's got to be exercises you can do and things you can try as opposed to just theorizing. And I don't think it's a bad thing. Like I said, there's parts of the book that explain different speakers and, analyze. None of that's wrong per se, but there's a gap between reading a book and then actually going onto the stage or in front of people you're feeling nervous. And we have to bridge that gap. And that's, again, a big part of what I do or what my work is about. Sorry for interrupting you.
Okay. So then you work in person with people too, because I know you have a new offering that I thought was very intriguing because it's really incorporating more of the looking at your limiting beliefs or your imposter syndrome and combining that with technique and skill. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. So it's interesting, just to take a step back, it's interesting how much COVID affected all of us in terms of the way we work. And I didn't think it was affecting me in terms of the way I work, with the exception, of course, I pivoted into coaching over Zoom, like many people had to do to work over Zoom. But I do have an office in San Francisco. I do see people in person. That's true. But I do it less, just like most people. Outside of construction, commercial construction, most people are not in the office 24/7. But in any case, so the new offer I have, what I was doing before COVID and kept with on some levels was doing a series of sessions for people. And I'm still doing that when asked, when it feels like it's right. But one of the things I noticed is many parts of what I do could actually just be fit in and condensed into a short program, a half-day program or something like that. So that's what the new offer is. I started this summer and it's working very well. And I think for the people who really want to be seen in person and have an in-person coaching experience, it works exceedingly well because, again, there's only so much time in a day. And there's, many of the people I work with are very busy, of course. And so if we can take approximately 4 hours or whatever feels right and get the mindset piece to have the needle moved on the mindset piece, get the physical voice and speech training down, which you'll still have to do exercises and some work, be just like going to the gym. And then the crafting of the delivery down, we can actually do quite a lot of that in just a half day. And that seems to be, like I said, working well with people's schedules.
That's, I think, more effective in a lot of ways, only because you're immersing in it. You're not Like when I'm doing something, I'm in it and then I'm out of it and then I'm back in it and then I'm out of it. It's not as effective for me. So
Right.
I like that idea. So what would you say that most of your clients would say they've come away with after working with you? Like what is the one thing that you've heard consistently across the spectrum?
Yeah, I used this word earlier because it is the word that I always hear is empowerment. And when I've gotten testimonials from people or thank you emails or thank you notes, sometimes I get chocolates. Hint,
Ooh.
hint, to have them out there. And I don't mind them. I do. I occasionally get little presents in the mail. Okay. So yeah, more often than not, what I'm hearing is what I walked away from Lisa's office with was a feeling of empowerment that I can show up, that I don't have to deal with internal judgment anymore. And by not dealing with your internal judgment anymore, like the inner critic or the imposter syndrome, you're not afraid of the external anymore. Because in the end of the day, the inner judgment is 10,000 times worse than any outer judgment is going to be for most of us. And when I say most, I mean 99.9%, leaving out a couple presidential candidates. Most of us don't have stages that big.
No. I would say that having compassion for yourself is so underrated. I don't think people even realize or recognize how to give compassion. I'm working with a gentleman, and we've had to talk a lot about having compassion.
Mm.
And I said, it's not about the spilt milk. It's about how we're going to keep from spilling it again in the future, and that
Mhm.
we should expect that we're going to spill it. So we might not always quelch that inner critic. We might not always give the perfect speech. I think you've talked about this before where, hey, some days you're spot on and other times your dog is at the vet and is having surgery or something in life is going on. And it's really about leaning into the skills and developing the skills and having confidence. I keep going back to that word. You say empowered, and I think that's closely tied
Mhm.
to confidence in yourself and an inner trust in who you are and what you bring that is uniquely you. And I think that goes back to knowing yourself and being the kind of speaker that is giving the audience the real you and not like trying to be a copy of some other famous speaker.
Mhm.
Do you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, address an authenticity occasionally for sure. And it's in the book a little bit about, I think I call it compare and despair in there. Because if we do that too much, if we're actually comparing ourselves to other people, it typically is not helpful. There's a vast difference between seeing a speaker and saying, wow, you know what? They're able to use humor and I never use humor. Maybe I'm going to try that. That's interesting to me. Or, they really, really pause a lot more than I do. I'm going to try that. That's interesting. So that's, again, talked about the creative side, right? It gives you somewhere to go, which is different from saying, oh my gosh, that person is such a great speaker. My boss is such a great speaker. I hear that one a lot. I'm never going to be like that. I wish I could speak like her. I wish I could speak like him. You don't need to speak like her or him. One of the first things I say to clients who say that, or even just in conversation, is likely they had training. If you're a Silicon Valley CEO, you've had training. That's it, period. And if you haven't, you show up nervous and make mistakes you wish you hadn't made. And that's not great either, right? So yes, the training, the techniques that I was talking about, and that's my thought process, like I said, comes a lot from having been an actress for so long. And you do have to show up. If your job is to play Lady Macbeth, it doesn't matter if your dog died that morning. You've got to go do a matinee. That's it. That's it, right? But
Right.
your training and your preparation and your work is there for you and it will always work for you. And each night, just like with each talk you do, will be slightly different depending on the audience, depending on the mood in the air, slightly different. And that's okay. It should be a living, breathing thing, or else we're going to feel stagnant and bored. So yes, I agree with what you said. The technique, it will always work with you, work for you. And as far as, we were touching upon a little bit here and there, what does the audience perceive? How do they feel about your performance, so to speak? Generally speaking, a couple things I want the listeners to really hear and take away, if nothing else, from what I've said so far, is that audiences want you to succeed. They want to hear you. They're rooting for you. They're there because they need the information you're giving them, or they want to be inspired by your story, or there's a reason that they're there and they want you to do great. They're your friend. And it's good to remember that. And that when even if you're going on to a main stage, a larger stage, you're having a conversation with a group of people there at that one moment, nowhere else, no other time. You're just there in that moment. And you can make that moment really great for yourself and make it great for them as well. And it's a choice. And yes, you need training in it, just like you need training in anything in life. That's okay. There's no shame in that. And you're right. And when you said everybody can have an off night, everybody can have an off night. I'm sure Laurence Olivier was not great every single performance. He might have been. But in any case, he did say, I will say this, though, one of his famous quotes, I won't remember it verbatim, but one of his famous quotes was about stage fright. I throw up backstage every first performance, every opening night I'm throwing up. And he was considered the greatest actor in the world for what, 20 years, something? So.
Yeah, no, it's human. And also those nerves give us things. Just because we have anxiety doesn't always mean that it's bad. It helps our focus. It helps us be readied. It's not always a bad thing. I was wondering if there's any parting advice or anything that you'd like to share with the audience before we have to say goodbye.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. Yeah, the advice I was going to give on seeking a coach is make sure that if you're looking for one, make sure that you find somebody with pedagogical degrees, at least one pedagogical degree. It's best to find somebody with teacher training and experience. Because if you go to somebody who only has one or the other, it can be a little shaky. They might notice where you might be able to improve, but they're not going to give you the tools to improve. And it can make you feel much more self-conscious than you did when you walked in their office. So, I suggest that people do their homework on what they're looking for, like you said. And the last is what we were talking about before, that empowerment means that you have choices. You decide in the moment. You decide what kind of training you want. You decide how you're going to relate to yourself, your audience, and so on.
I like that a lot. Well, thank you, Lisa. And once again, we're going to post your website on the show notes or in the show notes. And it's lisawentz.com, LISAWENTZ.com. And take it from me. She's amazing. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And I look forward to having you join me in the next episode of Flavors of Emotions. Thank you.